Matthew chapter 1 verse 11. And Josiah begat Jeconiah and his brethren, about the time they were carried away to Babylon. Now hold that name, Jeconiah. Jeremiah chapter 22 verse 30. Write ye this man down as childless, a man that shall not prosper in his days. For no man of his seed shall prosper, sitting upon the throne of David and ruling any more in Judah. Now hold those two verses in your head at the same time. One verse places a man named Jeconiah in the direct bloodline of Jesus. The genealogy Matthew opens his entire gospel with, the chain of ancestry meant to prove that Jesus is the heir of David and therefore the Messiah. The other verse is God speaking through the prophet Jeremiah, placing a curse on that exact man, saying no descendant of his will ever sit on David's throne again. These are not verses from different traditions. They are not texts that require scholarly reconstruction or careful translation to bring into conflict. They are two books inside the same Bible, making two statements that directly contradict each other, and the contradiction sits in chapter 1. That is where I want to start. Not with what scholars have said about it, not with the harmonization attempts that have been circulating for 2,000 years. With the verses themselves, side by side, the way a history teacher asks his students to look at two primary sources that cannot both be right. I spent 35 years teaching history. When two documents contradict each other directly on a matter of verifiable fact, that is not an inconvenience. It is the most interesting thing in the room, because one of them is wrong, or both of them are wrong, or someone stitched them together without reading both of them carefully, and the truth of what happened is somewhere in the gap between them. This is what Spinoza called the beginning of honest reading. Let me tell you who Jeconiah actually was, because the name gets flattened in the genealogy, and he deserves more than a single verse. He was a king, the penultimate king of Judah before the Babylonian exile, the second to last person to sit on David's throne in Jerusalem before that throne was gone forever. His name appears in three different forms in the Hebrew Bible: Jehoiakim, Coniah, and Jeconiah. That third form, Coniah, is significant. The original name Jehoiakim contains the divine prefix Jeho, a contraction of the sacred name of God. When Jeremiah addresses him in chapter 22, he calls him Coniah. He strips the divine prefix. The man has been reduced by the stripping of God's name from his own. That is not an accident of translation. That is Jeremiah making a theological point about what this king has become in God's eyes. Jeconiah came to the throne in Jerusalem in 597 BCE. He was 18 years old. By some accounts, he may have been 8. The numbers in the ancient records do not fully agree, but what every account agrees on is this: he was young, he was new, and within 3 months and 10 days of taking the throne, the Babylonian army under Nebuchadnezzar arrived at the gates of Jerusalem. Jeconiah made a decision that no other Davidic king had made before him. He walked out of the city and surrendered. He surrendered the city, the treasury of the temple, the treasury of the palace, and his own freedom. He was taken to Babylon as a prisoner along with his mother, his wives, his officials, his officers, and 10,000 other Judeans, the craftsmen, the smiths, the skilled workers, the military men, everyone who might be useful to a Babylonian empire or dangerous to a Babylonian occupation. He would spend 37 years as a prisoner in Babylon, 37 years in captivity, in a foreign city, under the authority of a foreign king who had dismantled the kingdom he had inherited. That is the man Matthew put in Jesus' family tree in verse 11 of chapter 1. And Jeremiah, writing from within that same catastrophe, addressed him directly, not with comfort, not with the language of a prophet who sees eventual restoration, with words that sounded to every reader who knew their Hebrew scriptures like a permanent sealing of a broken lineage. Write this man down as childless. Not actually childless. Jeconiah had sons. The text is theological, not biological. To be written down as childless in the ancient world meant to have no lineage that counts, no heir who inherits, no son who carries the name forward in the ways that matter. Jeremiah is not denying that Jeconiah has children. He is saying that none of his children's children will ever sit on David's throne and rule in Judah again. That curse lands on a specific place, with a specific consequence addressed to a specific man. And then Matthew, 700 years later, places that man in the direct ancestral line of the one he is arguing is the rightful heir to David's throne. Spinoza wrote in the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, chapter 7, that when two passages in the sacred text appear to contradict each other, the interpreter faces a choice. The traditional choice is harmonization. Find a reading of both passages that makes them compatible, even if that requires bending each text out of its natural shape. The honest choice is harder. Let both texts say what they say, ask which is historically reliable and in what context it was written, and follow the evidence of the contradiction wherever it leads. What harmonization closes, the contradiction reopens every time someone reads carefully enough to notice it. Jeremiah's curse has three components, and each one matters. The first, personal failure. A man that shall not prosper in his days. 3 months and 10 days, surrender, visibly, historically fulfilled. The second, dynastic extinction. No man of his seed shall prosper, sitting upon the throne of David and ruling any more in Judah. No descendant on the throne ever. The Hebrew does not contain a qualification or a time limit. It uses the language of permanent foreclosure. The third comes a verse earlier, in Jeremiah 22, verse 24. God says of Jeconiah, "Even if you were the signet ring on my right hand, I would still tear you off." The signet ring was the seal of royal authority, the impression in wax that was his word, his command, his identity. "I would tear you off" means you no longer carry my seal. Now here is where it gets complicated. In Haggai chapter 2, verse 23, written after the exile after Persia defeated Babylon, God speaks to Zerubbabel, the governor of Judah, and Zerubbabel is Jeconiah's grandson. God says to Zerubbabel, "I will make you like my signet ring." The exact image removed from Jeconiah is restored to his grandson. Scholars have argued for 2,000 years that this lifting of the curse is the key, that Jeremiah 22 applied to Jeconiah personally, that it was reversed in Zerubbabel's generation, and that Jesus, coming centuries later, inherits the restored line. But Zerubbabel never sat on David's throne. He was a governor under Persian authority. If the curse was lifted and the signet ring restored, the historical outcome produced no king of Judah. The throne remained empty for 5 more centuries. If the lifting produced no political restoration, in what concrete sense was the curse reversed? And if it was not reversed, then placing Jesus in Jeconiah's line does not give Jesus a path to the throne. It places him under a divine bar against that claim. There is something about the passage in Matthew chapter 1 that tends to get overlooked in the rush toward harmonization. Matthew did not hide Jeconiah. He put it plainly in chapter 1, verses 11 and 12. Josias begat Jeconias. Jeconias begat Salathiel. The name is right there, in the first chapter, in the first 12 verses. Matthew's community knew the Hebrew scriptures deeply. The Gospel of Matthew is the most Jewish of the 4 canonical Gospels. Its author quotes the Hebrew prophets more than any other Gospel writer. He opens his text with the phrase, "the book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham." He is writing for people who know what it means to be a son of David, who know the prophetic promises attached to that lineage. Those readers knew Jeremiah 22. So why did Matthew include the name? There are 2 possibilities and neither one is comfortable. The first, Jeconiah is the hinge of the Solomonic royal line. He is the last king before the exile and the first name in the line after it. There is no route from David to Jesus through the established royal succession that does not pass through Jeconiah. Matthew included him because the lineage required him. If that is true, Matthew included a name he knew was cursed because the alternative was losing the royal Davidic claim entirely. The second, Matthew's community believed the curse had been lifted through Zerubbabel, that the Haggai verse about the signet ring reversed the Jeremiah prohibition, and the name was included because they thought the problem was solved. Both possibilities have been argued by serious scholars across Christian history. Neither has produced a consensus answer. What has been produced is 5 different proposed solutions to what scholars call the Jeconiah problem. It was the winter before last. The library closes at 8 on Thursdays. and I'd been there since about 2 in the afternoon, which is not unusual for me, a retired man with no particular place to be, and a list of books to work through. I had requested a title through interlibrary loan several weeks earlier, Raymond Brown's The Birth of the Messiah, published in 1977 by Doubleday. Brown was a Catholic priest and one of the most respected New Testament scholars in the 20th century. His analysis of the infancy narratives in Matthew and Luke is the kind of work that other scholars cite as a baseline when they are writing their own work. I had been waiting for it. Libraries in East Tennessee do not always have specialized scholarly texts on the shelf, and interlibrary loan requires patience. When it came in, I spent several hours reading through the genealogy section, the part where Brown works through Matthew chapter 1, with the meticulous attention that characterizes everything he writes. I found the footnote on Jeconiah about halfway through the genealogy analysis. It was not the main argument. It was a footnote, the kind of dense, scholarly endnote that a general reader would skip over. Brown acknowledged what he called the Jeconiah problem. He laid out the contradiction between Matthew 1:11 and Jeremiah 22:30. He noted the scholarly debate. He traced the proposed solutions. He was careful, as scholars of his training tend to be, not to press the contradiction into territory that would make the text easier to dismiss than to engage. But the verses were right there in the footnote, and when I went to Jeremiah 22 and read 30 through to the end of the chapter, and then came back to Matthew 1 and read from verse 1 through 12 again, something happened that I did not expect. It was not anger, not the feeling of catching someone in a deliberate deception. It was more like the sensation of standing in a room where something large has just shifted. The whole structure of what you are looking at has moved slightly, and you're not sure yet what it means, but you know you cannot look at the room the same way anymore. I sat with it for a while. The library was quiet. There were a few other people at the tables around me, and nobody was paying attention to a retired teacher with his reading glasses pushed up on his head and 2 books open in front of him. I thought about all the sermons I had heard that began with the genealogy of Matthew. I thought about the times the genealogy had been read aloud in a church service, the long roll of names that most congregants did not know, the recitation that was supposed to anchor Jesus in the continuity of Jewish history and royal lineage. I had never heard a preacher stop at verse 11 and ask about Jeremiah, not once, in 50 years of attending church. That is not an accusation. Most preachers read the genealogy the way most people read genealogies, as a list that establishes credentials without requiring detailed interrogation of each individual name. But when you do interrogate the name, when you pull up Jeremiah 22 and read it alongside Matthew 1, the interrogation does not produce a comfortable answer. It produces the Jeconiah problem. And the existence of 5 separate scholarly attempts to solve that problem tells you something important. The problem is real. Let me walk you through the 5 proposed solutions, because the number of them is itself a piece of evidence. When a historical question produces one proposed harmonization, that harmonization may be correct. When it produces 5, the problem is real, and no single answer has been persuasive enough to end the conversation. The first solution: the curse was temporary or limited in scope. Jeremiah 22:30 on this reading is not a permanent prohibition, but a generational judgment, applicable to Jeconiah and perhaps his immediate sons, but not extending infinitely into his descendants. The verse uses strong language, but the covenant God makes with Israel is always subject to renewal, and prophetic pronouncements of judgment in the Hebrew Bible are regularly conditional on the behavior of those who receive them. The difficulty with this reading is the text itself, sitting upon the throne of David and ruling any more in Judah. The phrase "anymore" carries the weight of permanent termination. The Hebrew prophets knew how to express conditional judgment, and they did so in other contexts. Here the language does not qualify. It does not say "no descendant until your line repents." It says "no descendant." The text does not obviously support limitation, and the scholars who argue for limitation are doing significant work against the natural reading of the passage. The second solution: the curse was lifted through Zerubbabel. Haggai 2:23, God addresses Zerubbabel with the signet ring image that was removed from Jeconiah in Jeremiah 22. On this reading, the prophetic curse was reversed in the next generation. Zerubbabel represents the restoration of the Davidic covenant line, and Jesus, coming after Zerubbabel, is not under the curse, but after its lifting. The difficulty here is what I described earlier. Zerubbabel did not sit on David's throne. If the curse was lifted in Zerubbabel's generation, the throne was not available for him to sit on. The Persians held authority over Judah. The claim that the curse was lifted cannot be verified by the historical outcome. And if the lifting of the curse produced no political restoration, in what concrete sense was it lifted? The third solution, legal versus biological inheritance. Matthew's genealogy on this reading is a legal record of who had the right to claim the throne, not a biological chain of direct paternity. Jesus inherits the legal claim through Joseph without the biological descent and without the biological curse. The difficulty, if the genealogy is legal rather than biological, and Jesus is not biologically Joseph's son, then Matthew's chain gives Jesus no Davidic blood at all. A legal genealogy that ends in a man who is not the biological father establishes a claim to nothing. The question of what makes someone an heir to David is not answered by pointing to the legal record if the legal record is exactly what is being questioned. The fourth solution, Luke's genealogy bypasses Jeconiah entirely. Luke chapter 3 traces Jesus through David's son Nathan rather than Solomon. Nathan's line has no kings, no temple succession, no Jeconiah. The Jeremiah curse never reaches it. But Luke's genealogy and Matthew's genealogy share almost no names in common between David and Joseph. Two genealogies for the same man that diverge at nearly every point across 40 generations are not two versions of the same family tree. They are two separate documents making incompatible claims, and harmonization cannot close the gap between them. The fifth solution, the virgin birth, eliminates the curse. If Jesus is not biologically descended from Joseph, if the conception was by the Holy Spirit, as both Matthew and Luke assert, then the biological curse attached to Jeconiah's bloodline does not pass to Jesus, because Jesus does not have Jeconiah's blood. The virgin birth on this reading is not just a miraculous event with theological meaning. It is the mechanism that separates Jesus from the curse. This solution is theologically inventive, and it has been made seriously by Christian scholars who find it compelling. Its difficulty is the one that has troubled careful readers for a very long time. If Jesus is not biologically Joseph's son, then the genealogy in Matthew chapter 1, which runs from Abraham through David, through Jeconiah, through Joseph to Jesus, does not give Jesus any biological connection to the Davidic lineage. The whole point of the genealogy is to anchor Jesus in David's line, but if the biological chain is broken by the virgin birth, then Jesus is not biologically a son of David. He is the son of Mary, whose genealogy Matthew does not trace. The virgin birth, offered as the solution to the Jeconiah curse, simultaneously dissolves the Davidic claim the genealogy was constructed to establish. One problem creates the solution. The solution creates a different problem. What Luke was doing is the most revealing part of this whole question. Luke's genealogy does three things Matthew's does not. It runs backward from Jesus to Adam, not forward from Abraham, establishing universal human connection rather than royal credentials. It goes through David's son, Nathan, not Solomon, a line with no kings in it, no temple succession, no royal court. And it contains no Jeconiah. If you go through Luke's genealogy from David to Jesus, Jeconiah is simply not there. He cannot be. Luke went through Nathan. Jeconiah is in Solomon's line. The Jeremiah curse does not reach Luke's genealogy at all. Two gospel writers, the same person. One includes a man God explicitly cursed in the opening verses of his genealogy. The other constructs a completely different family tree that avoids that man entirely. That difference is not accidental. Luke's author knew Jeremiah. Matthew's community knew Jeremiah. Everyone writing seriously about the Hebrew scriptures in that period knew Jeremiah. The reasonable historical inference, the one a retired history teacher draws when two primary sources diverge sharply at one specific point, is that the divergence is deliberate. Luke's author was aware of the Jeconiah problem and routed around it. The existence of Luke's genealogy is not proof that Matthew's is wrong, but it is evidence that at least one early Christian community knew Matthew's genealogy had a problem, and chose to solve it by starting over. Two Gospels, the same Jesus, two incompatible family trees. The same man God cursed is in one and not the other. When two primary sources give incompatible accounts of the same fact, the question is not how to harmonize them. The question is what the incompatibility tells you. I want to be honest with you about what I think this evidence adds up to and where my certainty ends. I am not a textual critic. I am not a trained biblical scholar. I am a retired history teacher who has spent 12 years working through primary sources in a converted spare bedroom in Knoxville, Tennessee. I have limitations, and anyone who reads this kind of material seriously should bring skepticism to every voice, including mine. What the evidence clearly shows is this. Matthew placed Jeconiah, a man cursed explicitly in Jeremiah 22, told that no descendant of his would prosper on David's throne, in the direct ancestral line he constructed to prove that Jesus is the Davidic Messiah. The contradiction between those two texts is not obscure, not a matter of specialist knowledge, not dependent on disputed translation. It is there in the plain reading of both passages, and it has been recognized by scholars across Jewish, Catholic, and Protestant traditions for centuries. 5 distinct solutions have been proposed. Each one has been seriously argued by serious scholars. None of them has produced a consensus. The fact that 5 solutions exist is not evidence that the problem is solved. It is evidence that the problem is real, and that no single solution has been persuasive enough to end the conversation. Luke's genealogy takes a different route. That divergence is historically significant, regardless of which genealogy is more accurate, because it shows that the earliest Christian communities were not all working from the same family tree, and at least one community chose a route that avoided the Jeconiah problem entirely. And then there is the 5th solution. The virgin birth is the answer to the bloodline curse, which resolves the curse by dissolving the biological basis of the very claim the genealogy was written to establish. Spinoza's method, applied here, produces a finding that the text itself supports. When a document is constructed to prove a specific claim, in this case that Jesus is the legitimate heir to David's throne, and that document includes within its opening chapter a name that a well-known passage in the same scriptural tradition explicitly bars from the throne, either the author did not know about the contradiction, or the author knew about it and believed it was not fatal to his argument, or the author knew about it and had no way to avoid it because the lineage required the name. We cannot know with certainty which of those 3 conditions applied to Matthew's author. What we can know is that the contradiction is in the text, that it was apparent to careful readers in antiquity, and that it has produced 2,000 years of theological labor to explain away what Jeremiah said about Jeconiah. That labor is itself evidence. Harmonization factories do not run unless there is a fire to put out. I spent 35 years in a classroom teaching students to do one thing with documents. Read them, both of them, all the way through, including the parts that are uncomfortable. When a student brought me 2 sources that contradicted each other, I did not ask them to find a way to make both sources say the same thing. I asked them which source was written first, what the author's purpose was, what the historical context was, and what the contradiction itself revealed about the period they were studying. I'm asking those same questions here, and I've been asking them since I sat in a public library in East Tennessee with Raymond Brown's footnote open in front of me and 2 biblical texts on the table, thinking, nobody ever showed me this in church. That is not an accusation against the congregation I loved or the pastors I respected. Most of them were not hiding anything. They were reading the genealogy the way genealogies get read, as a roll call, a list of names establishing lineage, the kind of text you get through on the way to the story. The list is long, the names are unfamiliar, and the congregation follows along until the narrative begins. But Jeconiah is in that list, right there in verse 11. And Jeremiah 22:30 is in the same Bible 17 books earlier, and the 2 texts do not agree. Nobody taught you to ask why. I am not telling you what to believe about Jesus, or about Matthew's gospel, or about the theological meaning of the Davidic lineage. Those are matters of faith, and faith belongs to each person who holds it. I left my own faith behind, slowly and painfully, and I do not wish that experience on anyone. I am telling you what the documents say. Matthew chapter 1 verse 11, the lineage of Jesus includes Jeconiah. Jeremiah chapter 22 verse 30, no descendant of Jeconiah will prosper on David's throne. The same Bible, 17 books apart, one says he's in the family tree, one says none of his descendants can inherit the throne that family tree is supposed to deliver. Spinoza found the method. Knoxville Public Library is where I found this footnote. And now the footnote is yours. That is what the documents say. The rest is for you to sit with.